Grand Rising, my beautiful kings and queens, and welcome to Morning Tea with Mel B. This week we're walking through history they didn't teach us, from roots to reality. Monday we went before the chains and reminded ourselves that African history did not start with slavery. Tuesday we gave flowers to the geniuses they left out, the inventors, the builders, the scientists, the doctors, the mathematicians, and the entrepreneurs whose brilliance helped shape the world. But today we pull the paperwork. Today's topic is the laws that built the cage, how policies shaped our lives. Because some people love saying, just work harder, but they skip over the part where laws, policies, violence, banks, schools, housing systems, voting rules, labor practices, and court decisions shaped the starting line. So let me be clear, this is not about excuses, this is about receipts. Because a cage does not always look like bars. Sometimes it looks like a school district. Sometimes it looks like a voting requirement. Sometimes it looks like bank denial. And sometimes it looks like a neighborhood map. Sometimes it looks like a law written in polite language with ugly consequences. So today we're talking about the systems that shape lives, limited opportunities, and still echo today. But first and foremost, as always, we always start with our affirmation of the day. So repeat after me. I am not limited by the cages built before me. I have the right to know the truth. I have the power to learn, build, heal, and rise beyond what tried to confine people. My history is not a burden, it is a blueprint. And let the people say, Ashe. Because today's episode may be heavy, but we are not carrying it to stay down. We're carrying it to understand how to get free. All right, let's move on to our morning tea. So kings and queens, let's start here. Policy is not just paperwork. Policy decides who gets protected, who gets excluded, who gets funded, who gets followed, who gets a loan, who gets in school, who gets to vote, and who gets a neighborhood with grocery stores and trees, who gets pushed into overcrowded housing, underfunded schools, unsafe jobs, and fewer opportunities. The National Archives explains that the 15th Amendment, passed by Congress in 1869 and ratified in 1870, granted African American men the right to vote. But that did not end the fight. African Americans still faced poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, violence, and other barriers that kept many from voting for generations. The Library of Congress notes that Jim Crow segregation affected public life broadly, including hotels, theaters, restaurants, churches, hospitals, schools, water fountains, bus stations, and other public spaces. It also notes that African Americans were denied voting rights through poll taxes, unfair tests, and other barriers. So when people say, why are we still talking about this? Because it has not ended in just one bad day. It was generations of systems. So the game was not just hard, it was designed that way. Some people talk about the African American struggle like it came from lack of effort. But when you look at the receipts, you see something different. You see laws, you see policies, you see court decisions, you see violence, you see denied loans, segregated schools, voting barriers, families blocked from being able to build wealth through home ownership. You see neighborhoods marked as risky, not because the people lack value, but because racism got a pen and started drawing maps. The National Community Reinvestment Coalition describes how 1930s redlining maps helped shape inequality in American cities. And the Chicago Fed notes that many studies have concluded that HOCA Maps propagated, they just made discriminatory leading practices possible, with many African American neighborhoods marked in red as low rated areas. So, no, this is not about people just needing to do better. People were doing better while the system was doing dirty. So, that's the conversation for today. So, let's move on to our daily focus, which is the laws that built the cage, how policy shaped our lives. After the Civil War, the United States passed the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment said the right to vote could not be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The National Archives says the amendment was passed by Congress in 1866 and ratified in 1868, extending liberties and rights to formerly enslaved people. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870 and granted African American men the right to vote. Now that sounds like progress, right? And it was, but progress created backlash. Because every time freedom took a step forward, racism tried to build a fence around it. After Reconstruction, many states created laws and practices to limit African American political power, mobility, education, safety, and opportunity. So yes, the Constitution said one thing, but the states said something else. So for my young viewers, a right is a fair rule that protects people and helps make sure everyone is treated with respect. A right on paper does not mean much if people can still be threatened, blocked, punished, or even unalive you for trying to use it. That is why we cannot talk about voting rights without talking about violence and suppression. So let's talk about voting. The 15th Amendment gave African American men voting rights in 1870, but that right was attacked through poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, fraud, and violence. The National Archives notes that the struggle over voting rights continued long after the 15th Amendment because barriers kept people from actually exercising the right to vote. The Library of Congress also states that African Americans were denied voting rights by poll taxes, unfairly applied tests, and other unjust barriers during the Jim Crow era. Now let's make that simple for our younger viewers. A poll tax meant you had to pay money to vote. A literacy test meant you had to pass a reading or interpretation test to vote. But those tests were often unfair, they were confusing, or applied differently depending on who you were. And intimidation meant some people were threatened just for trying to vote. So when someone says voting has always been free and fair, that's a lie. If you need courage to cast a vote, that is not democracy working smoothly. That is democracy under attack. So now let's talk about Jim Crow. Jim Crow was not just separated bathrooms. It was an entire system of racial control. The Library of Congress explains the segregation affected hotels, movie theaters, restaurants, churches, hospitals, public schools, and public buildings. Public spaces carried white only and colored signs. Many parts of daily life were legally separated. This means a person could not live freely. It was all about where you can eat, where you sat, where you used the bathroom, where you went to school, where you received medical care, where you could sleep when you were traveling, and where you could drink water. All of it could be controlled by law, custom, and threats. For my younger viewers, Jim Crow was a set of unfair laws and rules that forced African Americans to live separately from white people in places like school, on the bus, in restaurants, bathrooms, and in neighborhoods. These laws were meant to keep African Americans from having equal rights but many brave people fought against them so future generations could live in freedom and fairness. And those rules taught generations that separation was normal. But let's be clear, separate was never equal. Separate was designed to protect power. Now let's talk about housing, because this is where the cage got expensive. For many American families, home ownership has always been one of the biggest ways to build wealth. A home can grow in value. A home can be passed down. A home can help fund college. A home can stabilize a family. But African American families were often blocked from that wealth building path through discriminatory lending, redlining, restrictive covenants, segregation, and unequal access to mortgages. The National Community Reinvestment Coalition describes redlining as part of how 1930s discrimination shaped inequality in cities. The Chicago Fed notes that African American neighborhoods were often marked red, the lowest rating, and those maps are widely understood to have propagated discriminatory lending patterns. So when we talk about wealth gaps today, we cannot ignore housing, because if one group gets access to home loans, appreciating neighborhoods, better schools, and generational property, while another group gets denied, displayed, underfunded, and locked out, the scoreboard will not be even. My younger viewers, housing discrimination means African Americans were unfairly blocked from buying, renting, or living in certain homes and neighborhoods just because of their race. Because of this, many families were denied safe housing, good schools, and chances to build wealth, even though they deserve the same fair opportunities as everyone else. Education is another part of this. Segregated schools did not just separate children, they separated resources, books, buildings, teachers' pay, supplies, transportation, classroom conditions, and opportunities. The Library of Congress notes that schools were among the many public institutions segregated during Jim Crow. When schools are unequal, children do not get, they don't just lose a better classroom, they lose preparation, they lose confidence, they lose access, they lose networks, they lose the kind of support that can shape a future. My younger viewers, school segregation means students were forced to go to separate schools based on race. So African American children and white children were not allowed to learn together. This was unfair because African American schools often had fewer books, older buildings, less money, even though every child deserves the same chance to learn and succeed. And yes, people still achieved, people still graduated, people still became doctors, teachers, engineers, artists, lawyers, inventors, and leaders. But achievement under unequal conditions does not make the inequality acceptable. It makes the achievement even more powerful. Now we speak carefully and truthfully. Laws were one part of the cage, violence was another. The Equal Justice Initiative describes lynching as terrorism used to enforce racial subordination and segregation, and its research documents more than 4,400 racial terror lynchings in the United States between Reconstruction and World War II. In its Reconstruction research, the EJI reports nearly 6,500 racial terror lynchings in America between 1865 and 1950. With nearly 2,000 lynchings documented during Reconstruction alone, from 1865 to 1877. This matters because racial terror was not random. It sent a message. The message of do not vote, do not organize, do not testify, do not buy land, do not challenge white power, do not seek justice, do not step outside the role assigned to you. That was on purpose. So younger viewers, racial violence or terror means people were hurt, threatened, or scared on purpose because the color of their skin. It was used to make African Americans feel unsafe, powerless, but many brave families, leaders, and communities stood together to fight for safety, justice, and equal rights. Some laws were written in ink, some were enforced with fear. And we need enough courage to tell the truth about both. Now let's fast forward. The civil rights movement forced America to face some of what it had been pretending not to see. The Library of Congress notes that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 barred discrimination in public accommodations and helped dismantle formal segregation. It also notes that Title VII barred employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. The Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture explains that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 led to dramatic increases in voter registration and African American political representation. So for my younger viewers, civil rights laws help make sure everyone gets a fair chance in places like at school, jobs, voting, housing, and public places. They remind us that nobody should be pushed aside or treated as less than just because of who they are. So yes, laws can harm, but laws also can repair. The question is, who gets enough power to shape them? That is why civic engagement matters. That's why voting matters. That's why school boards matter. That's why local elections matter. That's why knowing history matters. But policy built cages. Policy can also open doors. So let's see who is playing in our face. So who's playing in our face? The people who say that the people who say that happened a long time ago, while living inside of what happened a long time ago. Because if generational wealth can carry forward, then generational harm can carry forward too. If property can be inherited, then consequences can be inherited. If opportunity can compound, then exclusion can compound. That does not mean people are helpless. It means people are honest. There is a difference between having responsibility for your life and pretending history had no impact on it. We can teach personal responsibility and systematic truth at the same time. So our receipts for today. Receipt 1, the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment was ratified on February 3rd, 1870, and granted African American men the right to vote. Receipt 2, voting barriers. African Americans were denied voting rights through poll taxes, unfair tests, and the other barriers through Jim Crow. Receipt 3, Jim Crow segregation. Jim Crow segregation applied to many parts of public life, including schools, restaurants, churches, theaters, and public buildings. Receipt 4, redlining maps and federal housing practices help shape long-term urban inequality and discriminatory lending patterns. And receipt 5, racial terror. EGI documents more than 4,400 racial terror lynchings between Reconstruction and World War II, and nearly 6,500 between 1865 and 1950 in broader research. And last, receipt 6, Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 led to major increases in African American voter registration and political representation. Now, before we move forward, we pause, because policy is not just paper. Policy touches lives. Policy touches bodies. Policy touches families, funerals, touches the empty chair at the table. Today, we honor those lives who were taken by racial violence, racial terror, and racial injustice. We honor the unnamed victims of racial terror lynchings whose stories may never have been fully recorded. We honor the people killed trying to vote, organize, own land, testify, educate themselves, or simply live with dignity. We honor Emmett Till, a 14-year-old child whose 1955 murder became a national symbol of racial violence and injustice. We honor Medgar Evers, a civil rights leader and NAACP field secretary in Mississippi, assassinated in 1963 for his work toward justice and voting rights. We honor Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Carol Denise McNair, the 4 girls killed in 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. We honor those whose names we know, and we honor those names that were buried by fear, silence, and missing records. We say ancestor, voter, child, mother, organizer, father, freedom seeker, truth teller, the ones who deserve to grow old. We remember them not to reopen wounds for entertainment, but because forgetting is how injustice gets comfortable. We are not here to make injustice comfortable. All right, now it's time for Common Sense Court, where we give the ruling. So today's question: can people truly pull themselves up if the system was built to hold them down? Our voting options are simple today. A, no, the system matters. B, yes, but it's harder. C, both can be true. And D, people use history as an excuse. So my ruling, both can be true, but do not insult people by pretending the system did not matter. Yes, people have responsibility. Yes, choices matter. Yes, work ethic matters. And yes, discipline matters. But laws matter too. Banks matter. Schools matter. Voting rights matter. Housing policies matter. Violence matter. Segregation matter. So when someone makes it out, celebrate them. Do not use their success to deny the cage even existed. The court is open, so drop your rulings. All right, now we are on to today roots to reality. Excuse me. Today's roots to reality connection is community survival. Across African and African descended communities, survival has often been communal. People shared food, shared childcare, knowledge, spiritual strength, protection, warnings, resources that continued in African American communities as well. When institutions excluded us, we built our own. We built our own church networks, mutual aid societies, burial societies, schools, community kitchens, neighborhood care, freedom schools, those barbershop conversations, beauty shop wisdom, and those aunties watching everybody's kid from the porch like neighborhood security. This is not just culture, this is strategy. Because when the law does not protect you equally, community becomes a shield. When banks deny you, community becomes a lender. When schools neglect you, community becomes a classroom. When history erases you, community becomes the archive. All right, on to our truth bomb for today. A cage does not stop being a cage just because somebody paints it with political language. Some cages were called law. Some cages were called policy. Some cages were called tradition. Some cages were called neighborhood boundaries. Some cages were called school zones. Some cages were called the way things are. But if it limited freedom, blocked opportunity, stole safety, denied dignity, or punished people for demanding justice, then call it what it is, a cage. And once you can name the cage, you can start finding the door. Our receipts today come from online websites. As of, I use the National Archives, the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and the Equal Justice Initiative, or the EJI. So kings and queens, today we talked about the laws that built the cage. We talked about how system shapes lives, but we are not ending in despair. Because if policy helped build a cage, then knowledge helps us to find the blueprint. And once you understand the blueprint, you stop blaming yourself for the walls you did not build. They wrote limits into law, but legacy still learned how to rise. Tomorrow, we continue with the resistance files, the rebels, the leaders, the truth tellers they sanctioned. And trust me, we're not giving the watered down version either. This has been Morning Tea with Mel B. Keep your roots deep, your mind open, and your truth louder than the cage. Period.